Here's Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, Episode 5, The Eisenhower Years in the 1950s. So Oliver Stone seems to be fast-forwarding. He fast-forwarded right through the 1950s in Episode 5. And what's untold, I guess, is that, what's untold for me is that what I think about the 1950s, I think about my father immigrating to North America. I think about basically him getting the American dream set apart. And basically there's all kinds of job prosperities. The economics were booming. Everything was great. It was all harmony. Of course, everything was great for basically white men, but then women and minorities, it wasn't so great. But then that's sort of the idealism that history has taught us, that everything was a great time and people immigrated and they get the American dream to take place. So what Oliver Stone tries to tell us in the 1950s is that Eisenhower comes in and he's this military president. He's a very moderate guy, and he gets out of the Korean War, and people love him for it. At the same time, he kind of, like, what he's saying is that he mucks into, it was the first time the Americans started, because they had the #1 military power, they were just putting so much money into their defense budget because of the Cold War. They had nuclear weapons, they had submarines, they had bombs. They started taking control. They were the big brother of the world, and they started mucking into other people's business all over the world and putting their own ideology about how things should be. Of course, you got Joe McCarthy coming in and all those kind of right-wing rhetorics saying this is how the ideology, this is what a real man's supposed to be, or a real human being's supposed to be. So Americans are, like, Eisenhower's kind of influencing it. And basically Oliver Stone's saying at the end in a couple of his speeches, and maybe it's taken out of context, maybe it's not, I don't know, but he's basically saying that Eisenhower kind of like saw what he did and kind of regrets some of the things that he did, because Americans at the end of the decade, they had so much influence on the rest of the world. It's going to set up Vietnam, and basically about the whole thing with communism and the Cold War and all this kind of mucky thing that the Americans did. And it's like it sets up so many more conflicts for them as the decades go by. And Oliver Stone kind of uses this decade as saying this is all these things that he did that kind of were the cause of future conflicts in the world. So of course that we know in the history books is that 1950s are a very prosperous time for Americans, while in the Under Siege the Americans are kind of like forcing all this their own interior conflict and their own ideologies to the rest of the world. So it's kind of an interesting documentary, and of course I'm sure if you're pro-American or if you're an idealistic American, you would despise this documentary because you would call it pure garbage and propaganda. But then if you're non-American, you're watching it, like myself, I guess, because I'm from Canada, you're kind of fascinated by it and like, yeah, that makes sense. That's my review.